Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another webinar at the National Library of Scotland. My name is Kenny Redpath, and I'm the Events Officer at the Library. Tomorrow, as you know, is Halloween, and I know this year will be slightly different for all of us, but we still thought we would try and have a couple of events that tie in with the Halloween theme. So we decided to go down the witches route, and boy, has it proved popular. Yesterday, for those who could make it along, we had Mary Craig talking about the 17th century Border witches, which saw a large audience in attendance. And today, I'm delighted to welcome into my sitting room over 250 of you to watch and listen to Alice Tarbuck talk about her new book, A Spell in the Wild, exploring what it means to be a witch today. Dr. Alice Tarbuck is the author of the poetry collection Grid and is an academic working at the University of Dundee. Her work on witchcraft has been featured in 404 Inc.'s Nasty Women, the Dangerous Women Project, and she runs Toil and Trouble, a witchcraft course. She has been invited to speak on witchcraft as feminist practice by Scottish Pen and by Freedom TV. Additionally, she has taught workshops for the National Library of Scotland, the Scottish Poetry Library, and further afield. When she was born, a white wizard came to her house to bless her, and this, she suspects, is where the trouble started. Over to you, Alice.
Thank you so much, Kenny, and thank you for having me at the National Library of Scotland. It's lovely to be with you all, albeit virtually. So, following on from yesterday's event, we're going to be revisiting the witch trials today. What I've prepared for you, which I hope you will enjoy, is a talk on animal transformation in witchcraft. This is taken out of a chapter of my book, A Spell in the Wild, A Year and 6 Centuries of Magic, which came out on the 1st of October and is available to buy at the National Library of Scotland bookshop. So I'm going to talk for hopefully 35 minutes, and then we're going to have some questions. So if you do have any questions about the book more generally or about what I'm talking about, please let me know. So I hope there's going to be some magic introduced in the next wee while. And I'm going to share my screen to share my slides with you now. You'd think after almost a year of this I'd be more proficient, but hang on a second while we do the digital wizardry required. So here we are. The paper is called I Shall Go Into a Hare, Human and Animal Transformation in Early Witchcraft. The witches, and indeed all magical affecting peoples, have a rich and global history of animal transformation. This differs vastly according to region, religion, and the nuances of these traditions, especially in non-Western cultures, and these have often not been transmitted well into Western anthropological traditions and continue to be misrepresented. As ever, colonial bias and Western worldviews impose narratives and ignore evidence, as is their wont, particularly in the slippery areas of magic and magical practice. It is all too easy to draw seductive parallels or generalize in ways which are insupportable. That being said, however, I am going to talk to you today about the way in which cultures all over the world associate witches with the ability to throw off their human form and slip into an animal likeness. The ability to slip from one form into another is prevalent in myths and folklore around the world. We have Scottish selkies, but there are also Chinese fox spirits, the Huli Jing, who can transform themselves between foxes and beautiful women. The confluences between the human self and the rest of the world are of perpetual interest, and the ways in which we share the world with animals, rely on them, and live alongside them is often explored through transformation. And dotted in among these folk tales, There are always stories of witches whose relationship to the more than human world was strong enough to allow them to slip right into it, to disappear out of their human forms and into those of the animals they lived alongside. Often, these are harmless stories or stories of domestic mischief. For example, witches becoming hares to steal milk from their neighbours. But there are other stories too, of women whose ability to slip out of human form was sinister, who took on the devil's work when they slipped off their skins. So one such woman is Isobel Gowdie, who was a cotter's wife from Highland, Scotland, who gave the most extraordinary account of her transformative abilities. Isobel Gowdie confessed to accusations of witchcraft in Aldern, near Nairn, in 1662. Her trial took place over 3 days. We know very little of her life from records, because in keeping with the record of with Scottish record keeping from trials of that time, Gowdie's confessions are recorded, but the verdict of her trial is not. It's widely believed that Gowdie was executed, and indeed, after such an extraordinary confession, as we will see today, it's not difficult to understand why. So Gowdie's confession is remarkable among witch trial testimonies of the 17th century in its length, its lucidity, and its detail. It's made all the more extraordinary by the fact that it apparently was not extracted under some of the harsher forms of torture used at the time. It's not known, of course, what leading questions were asked or how her stories were reinterpreted, but it is enough to notice the extraordinary way that Gowdie speaks. So enchanting is her confession, it holds the reader utterly in thrall. There's been a lot of work on Gowdie's confessions. For example, Emma Wilby wrote her book, The Visions of Isabel Gowdie, Magic, Witchcraft and Dark Shamanism in 17th Century Scotland, which is a brilliant book. And it argues that the lucidity and detail of Gowdie's confessions suggests the accumulated in the veracity of supernatural experience is certainly possible and may have been an expression of mental illness or a reaction to the lengthy isolation of imprisonment. It's simply impossible to tell from any confession extracted during the witch trials what the prosecuted person actually believed, but it is dangerous to claim that the prosecuted women really did have supernatural powers or undertook heretical practices, because it plays into the prejudices and beliefs that had those women condemned in the first place. In this regard, I think Wilby occasionally oversteps from historical evidence into conjecture. She goes as far as to suggest that the conditions of Isabel Gowdie's life were such that she might have fallen unwittingly into a trance, engaging in shamanic behaviours that gave her access to a supernatural world. Wilby argues that shamanistic experiences...
Alice?
Yes?
Really sorry to interrupt you. Your sound's a little bit jerky, so I might suggest you switch your video off for now, and hopefully that'll improve the sound.
What a plan. Sorry about that. Let me switch it off and then I'll reshare my screen.
No, just switch off your camera.
Is that all right?
Perfect. Thanks, Alice.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that, everybody. I hope the sound goes more smoothly now. It's the problem with the wonders of the internet, isn't it? I'll start that paragraph again. In this regard, Wilby occasionally oversteps from historical evidence into conjecture. She goes as far as to suggest that the conditions of Isabel Gowdie's life were such that she might have fallen into a trance, unwittingly engaged in shamanic behaviours that gave her access to the supernatural world. Wilby's argument is problematic and credits Gowdie with knowledge and spiritual education she simply did not have. What it does do, however, is ask the questions that are so important to understanding stories about witches becoming animals. What did it mean? And why do we see it in so many global cultures? So Robert Pitcairn collected Gowdie's confessions as part of his multi-volume 1833 work, Ancient Criminal Trials in Scotland. Pitcairn edited a large number of court transcripts from the 17th century, and his edition shows a number of editorial interventions. He was interested in stories, lurid accounts, anything that would make a trial stand out. And the book reads like a series of transcripts from a bizarre reality television show, with only the most exaggerated examples included. Isabel Gowdie is included as a curiosity. Come along and read the mad woman's words, perhaps shiver a little at the possibility of witches and their wicked appetites. The context of her trial is so important. Her standing in the docks, speaking to an audience of rapt listeners. As a cotter's wife in a rural village, it is unlikely she usually received such rapt attention when she spoke, or had such time and length to speak at. Even in a situation of appalling stress and with the fear of death, there is perhaps something seductive about knowing that once in your life, you are going to be listened to. And so, Gowdie didn't simply recount events as they happened. Her confessions are all singing, a fully embroidered tapestry of personal repentance, information about the supernatural, and perhaps most surprising of all, her spells. Gowdie shares her spells, and these, when they appear in Pitcairn's collected edition, are lineated as verse. They sit couched within the more prosaic aspects of the confession, alongside stories which show attention to narrative, trope, and symbolism. Gowdie clearly knew how to shape a story, and these were then recorded. Even without lineation, the poetic sections can be easily differentiated from the rest of Gowdie's confession by their rhythm and their rhyme scheme. Gowdie writes, or speaks, and it was recorded, that whilst in the service of the devil, she often changed forms, becoming a hare, a deer, a crow. Gowdie's confessions are far from the first magical confessions of transformation, but the uniqueness of her confession lies in its detail and the fact that she speaks her poem spell to the court. She reveals her secrets or invent them on the spot. Either way, the charms are beautiful and unsettling, and there they are on the screen for you. These charms might read like doggerel, but they're fascinating as fragments of poetry. The first noticeable aspect is that they are in couplets. The rhyme at the end of the line links the first two and second two lines. Rhyme and metrical forms are common in representations of spells and charms. For example, the metrical Anglo-Saxon healing charms of the Lacnunga and Bald's Leech Book. The line, with sorrow and sitch and meikle care, reappears throughout Gowdie's spell poems, and here it makes the transformation sound effortful, perhaps unpleasant to undertake. This is not a light-hearted affair, but rather a genuine satanic pact, resulting in the alteration of the whole self. The poem asks us to imagine what it might actually feel like for Gowdie's whole body to change, to shrink down, to grow fur. This idea of painful effort is reflected in the crafted poetry of the spell. The artifice of poetry is linked to the supernatural effort of transformation, and both are elevated from everyday experience. Now, Gowdie's spell poems are famous. Her confessions have inspired folk songs, such as Maddie Pryor's The Fabled Hare, as well as James Macmillan's work for symphonic orchestra, entitled The Confession of Isabel Gowdie. Maddie Pryor's song draws its text directly from Gowdie's confession and builds on it. Macmillan's work debuted at the 1990s proms, and he understands it as being a collective act of contrition an apology to all those witches cruelly tried and executed during the witch panics in Scotland. Both pieces of music are interested in alteration. The Macmillan offers eerie and unsettling fragments of horns, Gregorian chant, and bagpipe drone, which catch in the ear like the sounds of a dream. The idea of Gowdy transformation haunts Scottish culture. Gowdy offers spell poems for almost every purpose in her confession, for curse work, for celebrating the devil, for destroying crops and bringing illness. Among the most unsettling of these is her perversion of the grace, which is transformed into a spell, and there it is on the screen for you. This grace does not thank the devil as a traditional grace would thank God. Rather, it promises destructive acts to be taken in the devil's name, reversing traditional imagery of plenty, good health, and good fortune. These are transformed into promises to effect destruction and ruin the household of the person whose house they've broken into in order to conduct their feast. Gowdy understands the power of words to upend, to reverse, to invert natural order and offer turmoil in its wake. Because you see, spells are not just words. They are words shaped to do things, designed and spoken to have an effect on the world. The spells that Gowdy speaks in her confessions are exceptionally powerful. They are supposed to be able to rearrange the very fabric of lived experience. A woman becomes a hare, a household falls to ruin. Her spells upend the natural order of the world. Despite being slight and repetitive, Gowdy's spell poems are a form of ritual language. Ritual language is a linguistic designation that allows us to grasp the power that those spells would have. Ritual language is a language category in that it describes the language that makes things happen, causes changes to occur in the world. Theologian Wade T. Wheelock defines ritual language as language that is directly used in accomplishing the ends of the ritual operation. Ritual language removes us from everyday experience, indicates that we are in a place where words have particular resonance beyond being merely instructive or descriptive. It makes us attend to both the words and the form that they are spoken in. By using ritual language, Gowdy signals that she possesses these forms of knowledge and can understand and repurpose dominant forms of ritual language, such as Christian liturgy. What is most poignant about Gowdy's confessions for me is that they both contain and embody ritual language. As Gowdy confesses, her words form the basis of her judgment. As she speaks in the context of the courtroom, Gowdy condemns herself. She says that she repents, but nevertheless recounts in vivid and unembarrassed detail all manner of extraordinary crimes, lewd acts, and events that give her power as she tells them. The shocking acts reveal her to be, in the eyes of a court, not simply a cotter's wife, but a woman capable of killing men, stealing possessions, and transgressing the normative boundaries of female behaviour. Gowdy then undergoes another magical transformation from an ordinary woman to a powerful scion of the devil, substantiating and reinforcing the state's attitude toward heresy and female occult activity of the time. Her spells stand apart from the ritual performance, perfected moment power. For this alone, they are shocking and revelatory. Gowdy uses words to change into a hare, but she herself does not change, only her body. The language used in the spell is very particular and makes it clear that Gowdy undergoes transformations of shape, of bodily vessel, rather than inherent self. Gowdy does not become a hare, she goes into one. The form is later referred to as a likeness, a simulacra, rather than the thing itself. Throughout, the witch retains her selfhood. After all, she must be able to conduct the devil's business on his behalf while in the shape of a hare, and must be able to speak the second charm and return to her human form. This kind of almost changing, where a likeness is put on, rather like a costume, is a feature of human-animal transformation in a number of global Indigenous cultures. In his work, The Spell of the Sensuous, philosopher David Abrams explores the relationship between humans and animals among various Indigenous communities. In some, animals are seen as possessing knowledge and gifting it to humans through close relationships. Abrams says, many tribes, like the Swampy Cree of Manitoba, hold that they were given language by the animals. For the Inuit, as for numerous other people, humans and animals all originally spoke the same language. Humans and animals share such close proximity in these cultures that they can speak to each other. Interspecies differentiation is overcome by close attention. Many of these myths about the beginnings of life are transmitted orally. Speaking stories about speech is interesting. To tell these stories is a ritual act. For example, according to Naingiak, an Inuit woman interviewed by ethnologist Nus Rasmussen early in the 20th century, in the very earliest time, when both people and animals lived on Earth, a person could become an animal if he wanted to. And you can read the rest of that on the screen. This account of humans becoming animals is very different from Gowdy's in its culture of origin and in its purpose, but it uses similar ideas of language as the means by which humans might transform into animals. In this Inuit account, because humans and animals can understand each other, they can become each other. Transformation is figured as an act of interspecies empathy through shared language. This relationship between utterance and transformation is in many ways an account of the power of language, understood metaphorically and expressed through images of the more than human environment. What is interesting is its pervasión through diverse cultures. For example, the early Germanic word for a magic spell or sung charm is a galder, derived from the verb galen, to sing, a term applied especially to bird calls. The nightingale, for example, carries gale from galen and its very name. There is no doubt that close living proximity with the more than human creates intimacy, and that observation of the natural habitats of animals and plants produces a feeling of interconnectedness so acute for some people that it might seem to be a transformation into communication. The witches on the edges of forests, out of villages, sought connection, sought other relationships in the non-human environment. Gowdy's spell poems are one way of talking about these relationships. David Abrams argues that Western civilization represents the gradual distancing of humans from haptic knowledge of and intimacy with the more than human world. This is true, perhaps, but it is also true that certain individuals have always had closer relationships to the more than human world than others, for reasons of proximity, necessity, or choice. Although in general we are a more urban society now, it's important to remember that delight in the natural world is not solely a rural pursuit. There are witches everywhere, and even in cities, there are ways of attending to the more than human world. From bee hotels to allotments, from feeding birds to growing herbs, witches do not require forests or fields. It is important, I think, to explore Gowdie's spell poems as a means of communicating with and having meaningful relationships with the more than human world. It's even more important to understand them as part of a network of attempts to understand and describe human means of being with the world. These attempts are all perhaps a form of magic, a form of knowledge which changes the way we pass through and experience our environment. Whatever the intention behind Gowdie's recitation of spell poems, their effect has been significant. Witches, like Gowdy, were believed to have the power to transform themselves into creatures to do the devil's bidding. But their power was not limited to self-transformation. Witches throughout history and throughout myth have also been credited with the ability to transform others. And this is, perhaps for most of us, the more frightening of the two options. Certainly, it is terrifying in the Odyssey when the witch in Greek literature, fair-tressed Circe, dread goddess of human speech, turns Odysseus's men into pigs. Circe uses drugs and her magic wand to effect this transformation, a potion to create the pigs and a salve to eventually turn them back. Her intention was cannibal. Only an evil woman, of course, would try to eat men. Circe's is an act of bad magic, designed to unnaturally sate her appetite. In other source material, Circe is less hungry, but she's no less wicked. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, she transforms men into monsters and woodpeckers when they will not love her. She is cruel, quixotic, and powerful, and is among the most influential Western witch character in terms of cultural constructions of what a witch does and how a witch acts. Circe's pigs demonstrate the length of this tradition of witch transformation. The 7th century sees echoes of the witch trials in medieval Europe, where witches less often ate their victims, as Circe did, but instead put them to other uses. In medieval Europe, for example, this power was also believed to be maleficum, or bad magic, and it was used to transform human victims into animals. So we turn now to the folklorist Eva Pox, who in her book, Between the Living and the Dead, A Perspective on Witches and Seers in the Early Modern Age, discusses these transformations across Europe in depth. She writes that especially in Eastern Europe, victims were often turned into horses. These horses, among other farmyard animals, were then ridden on, used as transportation to get to witches' sabbats. The idea of witches riding or galloping on the alter ego of a transformed human played a significant part in European witch beliefs. Freedom to ride out at night, away from domestic commitments, and attend satanic rituals full of sex and dancing. Who wouldn't want a convenient human steed to do all that? Animal transformation fitted perfectly into religious and civil unease with female freedoms, and so it was easily incorporated into larger narratives of condemnation during the witch trials. The transformed victims were part of a larger story told about witches. that they flew through the sky to their sabbaths, using all manner of transformed items, brooms, sieves, humans and pets. In the hands of a witch, even the most quotidian objects can be transformed. Primarily, it was those in positions of power, ministers, judges, and those who questioned the witches, who asked leading questions and who circulated these tales of flying, showed witches as able to undertake demonic activities. Often, minor disputes or unexplained acts were not only investigated, but elevated into accusations of particular acts of witchcraft. It was suggested to the accused witches that they must have accepted magical help from the devil and then ridden high into the pitch black sky to meet him. These stories have fascinating origins. They trickle through society from the top down. Such images were not originally the fabrications of victims. Rather, they were narratives and images imposed while in positions of power. This is because any intellectual worth his salt in 16th century Europe was well read when it came to witches. And if he was a self-respecting scholar, then he drew all his information from demonologies. Demonologies were a particular literary genre that flourished between the 15th and the 17th century. Demonologies resembled medical or scientific textbooks in that they were written by learned physicians, jurists, and theologians. And their purpose was to examine all aspects of the interactions alleged to take place between Satan and his demons, with a focus on interactions between Satan and the women accused of being witches. These texts were used as practical guides for people to identify and subsequently prosecute witches. As you possibly know, especially if you were at the talk yesterday, before he translated the Bible into English, and in the relatively early days of his precarious rule, King James VI of Scotland and I of England wrote arguably the most influential demonology, called simply Demonology. King James was obsessed with witches, and his demonology was doubtless influenced by those that came before it. Latin treatises on witchcraft were being produced in Latin and translated into a variety of European languages as early as the 1430s. Notable amongst these is the well-known Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, which you can see on the screen, which was produced in 1487. This demonology was so popular that by 1699, 30 editions of it had been published. The Malleus Maleficarum contained information on, amongst other things, why women were particularly prone to satanic seduction. I'm sure you're all curious. The answer, perhaps unsurprisingly, was their weak character and voracious sexual appetites, a misogynist, church-sanctioned sentiment which echoed throughout medieval witch panics. This is one of the most common sentiments shared by diverse deity texts, which are often, in fact, very derivative, drawing on stock images, cementing these in the popular imagination. One often repeated belief was that witches renounced consciously and voluntarily the Christian faith, often in a ceremony that made a mockery of the sacrament of baptism. Satanic baptism, because it was both criminal and heretical, placed not only the individual into eternal damnation, but it also, really crucially, was thought to damage the well-being and safety of that individual's broader community, and thus the fabric of the godly state itself. So it's no surprise that particularly in newly Protestant Scotland and in a newly united kingdom, King James saw any threat to the Christian community as directly threatening the stability of his rule and indeed his very personhood. King James's Demonology is an extraordinary document. It's vivid and it's visceral, and it combines the scientific and the supernatural into a maelstrom of information. It contains lengthy descriptions of witches engaging in supernatural acts, from flying to transforming victims into animals. James had a fondness for vivid detail. In the Demonology, two main forms of transport are agreed upon for witches. And I'll quote here, "One way is natural, which is natural riding, going or sailing. And this way it may easily be believed. Another way is somewhat more strange, and yet it is possible to be true, which is by being carried by the force of the spirit, which is their conductor." And you can read the full quote there on the screen. The Demonology is a treatise completely fascinated by natural science, by what it is practically, rationally possible for our bodies and the bodies of witches to do. But it is fascinated by what demons can do too. It takes the devil as a natural fact of life, as concerning and present as the air or fire or taxes. And so what is natural and what is possible remain in enigmatic relationship with one another. Everything more or less remains possible, although James is anxious to explain it using science. What the Demonology is notably not concerned with, however, is the inner lives or desires of the women and men it believes to be witches. There is no sense that magical transformations might be, for example, a way of talking about how the world is experienced. Indeed, the only possible explanation for anything out of the ordinary is satanic intervention, and the only manifestation of magic is evil and outward-facing. Certainly, witches, rather than being complex people with interiority, are depicted as servants of the devil who act only under his will, and thus must be both discovered and ruthlessly eliminated. This understanding of witches profoundly limits how testimonies of occult experience were understood, and it profoundly limits the types of texts and testimonies which we have access to now. Eva Pox believes that these stories of riding horses, flying or squeezing through tiny holes to attend sabbats, were in fact metaphorical ways of discussing the transfer between levels of existence, the nuances of which were inevitably lost when witchcraft became a crime punishable by death. Rather than really travelling through door frames and keyholes, Pox argues that these are ways of trying to describe profound mental experiences, perhaps dreams, visions, trances, or other phenomena. It always makes me think of that feeling that sometimes you experience when you're falling asleep, when it feels as if you are falling. That could quite easily be described in some supernatural way. But in line with books on witchcraft and demonology, the courts at the time understood these experiences as literal events. For example, a court asked a Hungarian witch, Ilona Veros, where and through what kinds of holes could you pass? By flattening metaphorical speech, or refusing to entertain the idea that these might be personal psychic experiences rather than literal events, the courts reinscribed the ideas contained within demonologies, rather than exploring what might be true. So the courts strongly influenced witches and their confessions and subsequent narratives about them, and forced accused witches to confess to satanic pacts, transforming themselves and other humans into animals, and all manner of other extraordinary acts. As Pox argues, there was in fact a varied and multi-layered relationship between the experience and narration that characterized witch confessions. This layering between experience and narrative, and the gap that that creates, means that actual understandings of magic folklore, and practices of psychic experience are often lost. Of course, this is supposition on Pox's part, and we can never know for certain the actual lived experience behind the claims of witches turning into animals. Although we think, most probably, given what we know of physics and contemporary science, Isabel Gowdie never turned into a hare. But what is certain is that forms of witchcraft persecution have ensured that these diverse experiences cannot now be shared directly. Instead, they have to be examined at a slant by interpreting court documents and other little scraps of writing, or finding fetish objects or small material traces of folk belief. Certainly, to cultivate these psychic experiences, an intense and studied relationship with the broad world seems to be required. This interest in changing, in shifting from one form to another, didn't disappear along with the witch trials. It changed and altered with the times, but there is still as much interest as ever. Contemporary Western witchcraft is still extremely invested in altering appearances and in entering trance states, both in terms of human-animal appearances and also in altering one's human appearance to look like another human. One common and fairly benign form of early introduction to witchcraft that may resonate with many people who did this when they were teenagers is the idea of the glamour. Anyone who saw the witch films of the 1990s, such as The Craft, a still of which is pictured here, will remember the pivotal scene in The Craft, which was produced in 1996 and is a supernatural horror film. In the film, the teenage coven experiment with glamours, spells to alter their appearance. At first, they are innocent changes: hair color, eye color. Later, as the film takes its darker turn, glamours are used to assume the identities of others, to trick people, to stage deaths and falsify horrendous events. At one point, one of the characters tricks the other into believing her fingers have turned into snakes. The animal world is used in The Craft mostly as a threatening motif, an image of suppressed inner female wildness and sexual appetite. The witches want to harness all the energy of nature and then turn it into their own ends. Power hungry, they have gone too far, embraced the darkness, which is the very distillation of cultural beliefs about witches, informed by the witch trials. One of the things that we don't see so often these days are narratives of human-animal transformation that are literal. However, shamans and other spirit workers across cultures still practice trance states where they either speak to or in fact inhabit animal or spirit shapes and personhood. Whether we are now more aware of nuance, or whether it's simply that our narratives are no longer being suppressed, it is really interesting to see that humans still have a very strong need to turn to the more than human world in times of difficulty, in times of loneliness, in times of global hardship. We want to connect to the more than human world, whether that's through trance or through walking, whether that's through foraging or sketching. With whatever means we have, we want to enter into these close relationships. Certainly throughout lockdown, I've been paying a lot of attention to the nature very near my house, from watching crows try and pull aerials off to build their nest, to a particular pair of ducks who fly down my street at sunset some days. I've become very aware, not just of nature at large, but actually of individual animals whose lives I pay very close attention to now. And what really fascinates me, whether you have a pet or whether you feed birds in the garden or whether you throw starfish back into the sea if you find them on the shoreline, is that what we want What we crave, I think, often is to develop an ethics of care for our environment, to transform ourselves into the kinds of people who the world speaks to and we can speak back to it in meaningful ways. And this stretches as far back as Circe, and it encompasses the rich history of witchcraft. And now that witchcraft is legal, at least in our country, and research into witchcraft is legal, at least in Britain and in most of the West, what we are being able to do is to reclaim those nuances that Eva Pox is so concerned were lost during the witch trials, and see what it feels like once again, in whatever small way, to really radically open ourselves up to the more than human environment that surrounds us.